The Spanish Civil War is often considered to have been a dress rehearsal for the Second World War, with Spain serving as a microcosm for wider tensions between the dominant ideologies of the world at the time. Volunteers from across Europe, the Soviet Union, North America, and Latin America took up arms to fight in the Civil War, whose scars still linger in Spain, with the issue of Basque and especially Catalan separatism remaining at the forefront of political discourse in the country. As someone whose family is from Spain, I would like to throw my hat in the ring and argue that these anxieties are much older than the Civil War. In the same way that historians describe the period between the 8th and 15th centuries as a conflict between Muslims and Christians in the Reconquista, I propose that the 18th through 20th centuries represent a conflict between a traditionalist Spain and a radical Spain. The roots of this conflict are arguably much older than the 18th century. There were already radical, anti-feudal, anti-monarchical revolts in Spain just decades after the Reconquista, with the rebels seeking to establish a coalition of free cities or republics similar to those that existed in Italy. But these revolts were quickly put down by the crown, and the country would enter a period relatively free of internal conflict known as the Spanish Golden Age. Over time, however, the crown began to slip. Torrents of silver came from the Americas and caused inflation, the imperial army became bogged down in one too many wars, and generations of inbreeding in the royal family produced a horribly deformed king who died without an heir. By 1808, the once mighty Spanish Empire was brought to heel, and there was little it could do against an invasion by the rising French Empire under Napoleon Bonaparte. The French occupation is immortalized in the paintings of Francisco Goya. The Spanish resistance to French occupation is also very famous. It is where we get the term guerrilla in English, from guerrilla, or little war in Spanish. Small bands of Spanish rebels would fight French soldiers in the mountainous northern regions of the country. In the south, in Cádiz, the Spanish would draft their first constitution, which included different provisions for democratic rule, freedom of the press, and most importantly, the abolition of fueros, royal decrees which granted special privileges to different people, such as immunity from prosecution if they committed a crime. The British, however, defeated the French and put the Spanish king, Fernando VII, back on his throne. Fernando would then abolish the Constitution of Cádiz, solidifying absolutist rule. Here is when the long civil war begins. The radicals, led by General Rafael del Riego, would convince large sections of the imperial army to defect through what is called a pronunciamiento. The defectors notably included troops which were being sent across the Atlantic, particularly to Buenos Aires, to quell revolutions in the American colonies. Riego briefly brings democratic rule to Spain in what is called the Trienio Liberal, and most of the Americas gains independence in this period. However, the French Empire would invade Spain once again, this time to restore the monarchy. Fernando would rule for the next 10 years with an iron fist, but crucially, he would die without producing a male heir, instead choosing his daughter Isabella as heir. Traditionally, women would not be allowed to inherit the throne, so the next in line would be Fernando's younger brother, Carlos, rather than his daughter, Isabella. But divisions in the country ran much deeper than whether or not a woman should rule. The radicals took the side of Isabella and the traditionalists took the side of Carlos, but they were also fighting over whether the church should have as much power over public affairs, over the question of democratic rule, and an economic transition away from feudalism. These divisions turned violent in the First Carlist War. The traditionalist Carlists held out for nearly a decade, mostly around the Basque region, using many of the same strategies that had been used against the French occupation. But ultimately, the radical Isabelinos win and the constitution is restored. Many of the reforms that the Carlists feared came to pass, including the abolition of the fueros and the confiscation of land owned by the church and nobility in what were called desamortizaciones. Huge swaths of property were privatized, taken by the state and put on the market, sold to private investors. There is a massive transfer of wealth from the church and traditional nobility to private individuals in one of the most significant thrusts of modernization in Spanish history. As a result, Spain begins to industrialize, starting with Barcelona. Textile factories are set up, a national railway network is constructed. This is the beginning of modern capitalism in Spain. The new economic landscape of Spain generated new political currents, leading the radicals in this period to succumb to constant infighting. The first instance of this infighting occurs with the Isabelinos, supporters of the Constitution. They split into two factions: the moderates, who favored increased economic modernization but had no interest in political democracy, and the progressives, who favored a more democratic government. The progressives are largely excluded from power, so they launch a number of small rebellions, staging pronunciamientos throughout the reign of Isabella. Europe was at the same time being swept up by a wave of revolutions, so the progressives of Spain would be joined by these revolutionaries who were early socialists. Isabella is eventually overthrown in 1868, leading to the proclamation of the First Spanish Republic and also the second instance of infighting, this time with the progressives, which split into supporters of a federal republic and supporters of a unitary republic. As a result of these internal divisions, the new revolutionary government collapses within just 6 years. Thus, Isabella returns to power, completing her reign and passing the crown down to her son. To prevent any more infighting, Prime Minister Antonio Cánovas del Castillo secures a deal between the moderates under a new conservative party led by himself and the progressives, now constituted by the Liberal Party, whereby they would alternate power every couple of years. As a result, there are far fewer pronunciamientos, the military gets out of politics, and instead political dissatisfaction is absorbed by these essentially rigged elections. Cánovas also ends another Carlist war after offering to absorb the Carlists into his conservative party. The new stability brought about by Cánovas, however, came at the expense of progress. Modernization slows down, and the feudal organization of society is not completely undone. Large swaths of the Spanish population are impoverished, essentially serfs, working in latifundias, these huge feudalistic estates. It's during this period that a lot of Spaniards migrate to the Americas, particularly Argentina, in search of better opportunities, something similar to the Ellis Islanders of American history. Still, the limited reforms made during Isabella's reign had produced a not insignificant industrial working class. Barcelona and Bilbao saw the highest concentration of industrial workers, with Barcelona becoming known as the factory of Spain, or the Manchester of the Mediterranean. These workers met and socialized at taverns, cafes, and most importantly, workers' athenaeums, or Ateneos Obreros. The Ateneo was a space that served as a library, school, and meeting hall for union members all at once. Here, workers became educated particularly in the theories of German thinker Karl Marx, who advocated for the abolition of private property. In essence, the Spanish radicals began to view Isabella's reforms not through the lens that there was an insufficient spread of private property and a feudal state of affairs still existed, but rather that the new property regime was no different than the last, that there was still a rigid, exploitative hierarchy based on privilege and birthright. 3 important organizations are formed around this time, which absorbed the radicalized, discontented masses. La Unión General de Trabajadores, or the General Union of Workers, el Partido Socialista Obrero Español, or the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, and la Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or National Confederation of Labor. This last organization becomes an important bastion of anarchism, a more violent and impatient strand of socialism, so to speak, whose followers believed in what they called the propaganda of the deed. The first target of the anarchists would be the church, which they saw as an important enforcer of the new property regime, just as it had been under feudalism. In 1896, an anarchist sets off a bomb during a religious procession near the church of Santa Maria del Mar in Barcelona. Cánovas's response catches the attention of much of the world. 400 men and women are arrested and taken to a notorious prison at the fortress of Montjuic, where they are gruesomely tortured and driven to insanity. A number of the prisoners are killed, and this story becomes an international scandal for Spain, forcing Cánovas to release some of the prisoners. The survivors of Montjuic become something like celebrities, bearing their scars before appalled audiences in London, DC, and Paris. Still, the Spanish industrial workers arguably had it better than Spain's colonial subjects. While Spain had lost most of its American colonies, its two most profitable colonies, Cuba and the Philippines, had remained within the empire and managed to offset these losses. Cuba, in particular, was the sugar capital of the world, with many Cubans living in quasi-slavery at sugar plantations. The Philippines, meanwhile, saw increased importance as an access point to the Asian market after the construction of the Suez Canal. It was the Philippines that exported many of the raw materials worked on by Spanish industrial workers in Barcelona. But by the 1890s, anti-colonial revolts threatened to sever these two last Spanish holdings. Guerrilla insurgencies were led by the Katipunan Revolutionary Organization in the Philippines and by José Martí's Partido Revolucionario Cubano in Cuba. Cánovas responded to the latter by sending General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba, where he would round up the Cubans into concentration camps, killing upwards of 500,000 through disease, starvation, and summary executions. This earned Valeriano the moniker the Butcher of Cuba, and served as a powerful propaganda piece for the United States to itself intervene in Cuba and set up a protectorate over the island until 1934. While many Spanish radicals were not necessarily pro-Cuban and Filipino independence, socialist agitation at home was still inextricably linked to Spain's colonies abroad. For example, the immediate cause of the 1909 Semana Trágica was the calling up of reservists to fight in a colonial campaign in Morocco. Many of the reservists were the only breadwinners in their family facing certain death, while the wealthy were able to hire substitutes and avoid conscription. Riots broke out throughout Barcelona which were anti-militarist and especially anti-clerical in nature, as the transport ships to Morocco were owned by a prominent Catholic industrialist. Many convents were burnt down and sepulchres profaned. The issue of colonialism, especially with regards to Morocco, arguably held much greater importance for the Spanish traditionalists than the radicals. In 1921, a small force of Riffian tribesmen wiped out the majority of the Spanish army deployed to Morocco at the disaster of Anoual. It is considered to be one of, if not the worst military defeat that Spain has ever suffered. While Spain would ultimately regain its foothold in Morocco, the deep national humiliation of Anoual caused a revival of the Spanish traditionalists as a force in politics, as they had been largely pacified since the last Carlist War. If the Spanish radicals drew their support from the unions and to some extent the academics, then the Spanish traditionalists drew their support from the army and the church. The traditionalists blamed the corruption and inefficiency of parliamentary politics for the decline of the Spanish Empire. They take the pronunciamiento, the idea that the military are the true vanguard of the people, and use it to suppress constitutional rule rather than bring it about. General Miguel Primo de Rivera then assumed the role of the Iron Surgeon, a hypothetical Caesar figure who would temporarily hold power to cure Spain's ills with a heavy hand. But the longer Rivera held on to power, the more doubt there was that it was only temporary. The Spanish looked to the example of Italy, where Benito Mussolini had seized power and established a fascist dictatorship. Eventually, the monarchy withdrew its support for Rivera, and the Great Depression plunged Spain into an economic crisis, forcing Rivera to resign. Now, the pendulum of political power swung to the radicals, with the socialist parties winning a landslide victory in the elections of 1931 and proclaiming the Second Spanish Republic. However, the militant atheism of the new Spanish government alienated large swaths of the population. Spain, after all, was a devoutly Catholic country, even dating back to the Constitution of Cádiz. While the revolutionaries in the United States and France attempted to establish a secular state after overthrowing their monarchs, the ones in Spain enshrined Catholicism as the official state religion of the country. Now, the new constitution officially declared the separation of church and state. Church property was confiscated, priests barred from becoming teachers, and the Jesuit order expelled. This presented an opportunity to the traditionalists, who were now committed to achieving power through mass politics. The most important organization formed at this time then is the Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas, the Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Rights, which quickly became one of the most popular political parties in parliament, as it held the support of Catholics and even cut into the basis of support of the socialist parties, since it advocated for economic reforms based on the Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno. These were two encyclicals issued by the Pope which essentially advocated for the rights of workers while still preserving private property and denouncing socialism. The socialists, meanwhile, viewed CEDA as a fascist or proto-fascist organization which threatened to undo all of their reforms, or even worse, end the Republic. When CEDA won a plurality of seats in the 1933 election, unrest began to spread, beginning with a miners' strike in Asturias. The miners almost immediately began to conceive of the strike as the beginning of a revolution. The Minister of Public Works, a Socialist Party moderate known as Indalecio Prieto, tricked the Minister of War into selling him weapons of the Spanish army via several intermediaries, which he then smuggled to the miners. The miners also took weapons from captured arms factories and police barracks, as well as making use of their dynamite blasting charges, which they called the artillery of the revolution. Most famously, 9 priests were taken from their church school and brought before a revolutionary tribunal. After refusing a final offer to join the rebels, the priests were taken to a local cemetery and executed. These would become known as the 9 Martyrs of Turon. But dozens of other priests would also be killed. Embarrassed by the revolt, the Minister of War wanted a young general by the name of Francisco Franco to lead the army into Asturias. But the president, aware of Franco's monarchist sympathies, chose loyal Republican Eduardo López Ochoa instead, hoping it would minimize bloodshed. The suppression of the miners' revolt was, however, brutal. This is in part because the soldiers sent to Asturias belonged to the Army of Africa, which was a colonial army renowned for its brutality, now aimed inwards. Prisoners were raped and tortured, some were hacked to death, and naval and artillery shelling battered towns. López Ochoa had attempted to deter further atrocities by ordering the summary execution of 6 foreign legionnaires and Moroccan regulares, but by the end of the revolt, some 2,000 miners lay dead. A short-lived revolution had followed a short-lived dictatorship, and political polarization was at an all-time high. In this climate, the socialist parties formed a coalition known as the Popular Front and narrowly won the elections of 1936. This would be the last election of the Second Spanish Republic. Hundreds of people were killed in intercommunal violence in the following months, but perhaps the inciting incident for what would become the Spanish Civil War was the assassination of a prominent monarchist politician as a reprisal for the killing of a socialist police lieutenant. On July 17, 1936, a clique of military officers, notably including Francisco Franco, had made up their minds and declared a state of war in Spain. López Ochoa, on the other hand, had earlier been arrested and tried for war crimes he had allegedly committed during the suppression of the 1934 Asturian miners' revolt, only to be released due to a lack of evidence. He was now being transported between hospitals in Madrid, recovering from surgery. The hospital personnel attempted to fool an angry mob that had coalesced in the city by insisting that López Ochoa was already dead, but the ruse was exposed and the general, hiding in his coffin, was taken away. From here, an anarchist dragged him out onto the hospital garden and shot him before cutting off his head and sticking it on a pole. A sign hung from this grim display which read, Spain has always followed a different historical trajectory than the rest of Europe. While other European countries were expanding their empires into Asia and Africa, the Spanish Empire was collapsing. Spain also notably was one of the few countries in Europe to avoid both the First and Second World Wars. But perhaps one of the most important divergences in Spanish history from the rest of European history is that Spain industrialized too late and too slowly. This caused sharp political divisions and, in turn, an era of civil conflict which spanned nearly 2 centuries. The early collapse of the Spanish Empire had also contributed to these divisions by imbuing segments of the Spanish population with a certain anxiety and nostalgia for the past. This is something that is later experienced by Britain and France after the loss of their own colonial empires in the mid-20th century.
Have you ever been to a labour exchange? You know, the last time I went there, I was paid my money by a Sikh. A Sikh sitting there with his turban and a bangle in his hand. Now, I was 3 years with the Indian Army in India. I was 3 years in India in civilian life. I got on well with Sikhs, Hindus, the whole lot of them. But to walk into a British labour exchange and find you're being paid out your money by a Sikh, these are the people that in my small way I help train and educate. To go to a labour exchange is not a very edifying experience at all. You know, you change into your old clothes to go to the labour exchange.
In France, the process of losing Algeria brought the country to the brink of civil war with a failed coup d'etat in 1961. But in both countries, this post-imperial melancholia continues to shape not only politics, but the very psychology and mood of the public. In this way, I think Spanish political culture may be ahead of the other European countries. It already experienced all of this some 50 years earlier. So, once again, Spain might be a microcosm of what the wider world, or maybe just Western Europe, will look like in a couple of years.